Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about eutrophication. As we study eutrophication, I'd like you to keep these two questions in mind as we go throughout the notes today. First, by the end of this lecture, you should be able to outline the process of how eutrophication occurs, and you should be able to discuss the impacts of what leads to eutrophication and what would happen as a result of an aquatic ecosystem becoming eutrophic. To start off, I'd like to remind you that the idea of eutrophication centers around this idea that it has to do with trophic levels. So if we go back and look at what a trophic level is, we often talk about an organism and where it takes place in the food chain. As we look at eutrophication, a big focus is looking at the interrelationship among different organisms in the food chain, both producers and the consumers that are reliant on those producers. When we study eutrophication, we should consider both the natural factors that lead to eutrophication, things like succession in nature, where an ecosystem is changing over time, or things like volcanoes that would naturally add to eutrophication in an aquatic ecosystem. However, our big focus today is going to be artificial types of artificial things that lead to eutrophication in an aquatic ecosystem. Specifically, we want to look at the human aspects that lead to eutrophication, and some of the major factors that we should consider are the types of waste that humans can possibly contribute into an aquatic ecosystem through different industrial or the different agricultural features that are taking place near an aquatic ecosystem. In order to get a better understanding of this topic, we should take a close look at two different types of plants. We're going to focus on benthic plants, and we're going to focus on another type of aquatic organism called phytoplankton. Now, benthic plants, as you can see, these are the ones that if you grew up anywhere near a body of water are probably fairly common to you. Things like cattails that would be sticking out of the water, or one of the very common ones I recognize are water lilies or lily pads. Now, we call these a benthic plant. They have a few unique features compared to phytoplankton. Benthic plants often have their roots in the soil, and their roots in the soil are going to help them to absorb key nutrients that they need as part of their life cycle. The other thing that benthic plants are going to get is they are going to be in the water, and that location in the water is going to allow sun's radiation to go deep into the water where the sunlight can get down there, so the combination of sunlight and water and nutrients can help these plants with photosynthesis, so the radiation from the sun. Now, the other type of plant that we want to think about is going to be phytoplankton. Phytoplankton are these smaller plants, and phytoplankton, one of the most familiar ones is probably algae. A lot of times, if you're out swimming, you might see a lot of little green globs in the water, and they just kind of float throughout the water column. They can usually float near the surface, and what happens is the green algae are the other type of plant we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about eutrophication. So, as we study eutrophication, we should consider the process of eutrophication, and specifically where the different contributors are that lead to eutrophication. So if we think about a place like a lake, okay? We take a simple lake and we have our land here, and then over here we have our water. So in the land and in the water is the situation or the location we need to look at. Now, normally within here, as you saw in the previous picture, we have a lot of plants that can survive, and they easily are adapted to living in the lake. Things like lily pads, there also are other organisms, other plants that live deeper in the lake. And these types of plants, as we said, depend on their root system to get nutrients from the soil, and they depend on their location in the water and the water being clear enough to absorb sunlight. There's also other organisms that can live in here, like fish. We might have some other little creatures that live in the bottom of the water, and these things can feed on either other fish, they can feed on other organisms, or they could feed on plant material that they're going to use. Now, the biggest things we need to consider in the lake are the amounts of nitrogen, phosphorus, also things like availability of sunlight, and the turbidity of the water, and finally oxygen. So the combination of these things really help this to be a healthy aquatic ecosystem. Now, if any of these things were to change, there's a good chance that that aquatic ecosystem could be affected. So a lot of times, if we increase the nutrients in the body of water, let's say there is a factory possibly, or a farm, so things like farms, especially fertilizer or different industries, those two types of places or other human factors could lead to an increase of nitrogen and phosphorus or phosphates getting into there. So if nitrogen increases and phosphorus increases, we're often going to lead to an increase of phytoplankton that are able to grow in that area. So this is like that green algae. Okay? So if we have an increase of the phytoplankton living in that area, what's going to happen is the available sunlight that is coming down into the system, so the sunlight coming down into the aquatic ecosystem, is no longer going to reach deep into the water, but the sunlight is going to be stopped at this level because it's going to be absorbed by a lot of the phytoplankton at the surface. If there is a decrease of sunlight available, the phytoplankton that grow are going to increase the amount of turbidity in the water. Turbidity is how cloudy the water is. And as the amount of turbidity increases, this is going to cause a lot of these benthic plants to be reduced because they're going to get less phytoplankton or less photosynthesis going on because they won't have as much sunlight. So these deeper water plants are going to probably die off. Additionally, the nitrogen and phosphorus that normally would get down to the bottom of the water is now being absorbed by these plants. So there is less nitrogen and phosphorus at this lower level. So this plant is unable to get its nutrients, so it could also be affected by the increase of phytoplankton at the surface. As phytoplankton increases and benthic plants can decrease, as the benthic plants get killed off, that is going to increase the amount of oxygen it's going to take to decompose these plants. So the amount of available oxygen decreases, but then there's another thing that we need to think about. If oxygen decreases, that means the biochemical oxygen demand is going to increase. Biochemical oxygen demand, as we learned before, is the amount of oxygen required to decompose a lot of dead or decomposing organisms. So as biochemical oxygen demand increases, oxygen levels decrease. And if there's less oxygen in the water, certain animals that require oxygen are going to also possibly die. So as you can see, if this is our starting point here, if we start at this point of increasing our phosphorus and nitrogen in the water, the possible outcome is we have one type of organism that could be more successful, but as a whole, the entire ecosystem, the aquatic ecosystem, has a lot less of a chance of being successful. Overall, again, think back to these original questions that we looked at the beginning. How is eutrophication happening, and what are some of the consequences of it? Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you can keep on learning.